Got it. This is our 6th episode, and our speaker today is David Rose. Full disclosure, we share a last name. Oh, and an address. He is going to talk about neuroscience and the 8th principle. I also want to quickly give a plug to our next speaker, David Beauvais, who will help untangle the links of the supply chain. That is next week. David.
Okay, let me share my screen here if I can. Oh, okay. So Omar, can everybody see my screen and hear me and all that? Thanks very much to
Yes.
Omar for setting this all up. So this is a new sort of area for me that I've become quite, what should I say, invested in my retirement. I think some of you out there have been as poor at retiring as I have. So anyway, a new topic. I'm not, don't want to paint myself as an expert by any means. And some of you will probably know more and you can chime in. And if you want to put in comments and questions in the chat, please do so. And Ruth can kind of monitor that, and she's very good at interrupting me. So here's what I want to talk about today. These questions: where is prejudice found in the brain? Prejudice or bias, I'm not distinguishing them for the moment. When is prejudice found in the brain? How fast does it happen? How does prejudice, bias develop in the brain? And that's kind of the nature-nurture question. You know, is it something that some people would call instinctual, something we're born with? Is it something we learn, et cetera? Those kinds of questions. And most importantly, what can be done to reduce, control prejudice or bias? So I'll kind of go through them as best I can. So where is it? And just, this is a summary slide from one of the most recent articles. And it talks that race, perception, and prejudice evoke a network of activity in regions involved in person perception and emotion processing. And then it lists a whole bunch of areas. I just wanted to put this up to say, there's lots of parts of our brain where we can see prejudice. We're going to look at a few of them, the ones that people are most interested in. But I just wanted to start out to say there's a lot of places you can look at in our brains and find physiological and anatomical evidence of prejudice and bias. These are the ones that people mostly talk about, and I'm going to mostly focus there too. So you'll see there's a green area called the Fusiform Gyrus. I'll explain that one in a moment. The amygdala, which probably lots of you've heard in blue. The red area is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I'll often shorten it to just prefrontal cortex. And the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is in orange. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but if people want to, if we run out of time, which, I mean, if we have time at the end, meaning I'm less verbose than usual, then I'd be delighted to talk about that. So we'll be talking mainly about 3 areas: the fusiform gyrus, the amygdala, and prefrontal cortex. First, fusiform gyrus. And some of you have been in other talks I've given, and this is kind of a standard slide to say the back part of our brain specializes in recognizing things. So here's just some of the areas. There's lots more. We have specialized area for recognizing shapes or colors, lines, the orientation of lines, and an area which has become, in the last 20 years, really a major focus, which is an area you'll see in blue here, where it lights up, and I'll just say to start, what does it mean to light up? That just means that it shows up on computer screens, which are measuring how much activity there is inside a scanner, like an fMRI, an MRI scanner that some of you have had already. And what makes a region active is that there's a lot of firing of neurons, and every time a neuron fires, it needs to reuptake some oxygen and glucose because it's a biological thing. It needs energy. So all those devices are doing is measuring where's the energy being consumed in the brain, and presuming that the more active a region is, the more important it is for whatever the thing is you're studying. So face recognition has been done exhaustively. And so we really know that when people look at a face, usually, of course, in a screen, in an MRI machine, that area that you see here in blue lights up. That is, a lot of oxygen and glucose are being taken up there. It's very active. And it would be a different place, for example, if you're shown a picture of a toaster. There's a similar place for sort of objects, for example. Okay, so that's, we have specialized committees like that. I just want to, in each of these, I want to sort of talk about the variance. We're highly variable in how successful our face processing area is. So at the one end is people who have prosopagnosia. They literally can't recognize people by their faces. And it seems preposterous that they would be able to recognize people, but not by their faces. But they do. There are people who just can't do faces. All they see is, for them, all the faces look more or less alike. And you can see why that's true. Everybody has two eyes, a nose, a mouth. So they have to use something else to recognize people, like how they're dressed or the fact that they have a mustache of a certain kind or whatever. So they can look at features, but they don't recognize your face. They just say, oh, Billy's the guy that has that weird mustache and wears yellow shirts. Okay. And then there's people who are exquisitely good at face recognition. In fact, in England, we don't have it here. Police forces hire people who have, I forget, they have a word for people who are exquisitely good at faces to do police work with them. So they're easy to recognize people in crowds that are potentially villainous. And they have jobs because they're fabulous face recognition people. So variance. What is fusiform face area? This area had to do about race. One of the things that was quickly found out when people started being able to do these experiments is that people have a bigger burst of energy when they see someone, if you're white, if you see someone like this on the right, a white face, more glucose and oxygen are burned. It becomes more active. It lights up more than to an other race individual. And of course, I'm using here white because these were done in the US. It would be different in other countries, as we'll briefly talk about. But anyway, here in the US, one of the first places that you see bias is in the fusiform face area. And we'll talk about when the timing is, but it's very fast. And it was kind of a surprise that people saw literally black faces and white faces, treated them differently with this part of their brain. And for some people, that's the beginning of what bias and prejudice. The first place you go, oh my God, the person's brain right there in that really low level area has distinguished. This one's black, this one's white. Not just who it is, but their race. Okay, second area we're going to talk about, you probably have heard more about, the amygdala. So here it is. Guess I'd like to point out that these structures are kind of low down in the nervous system. They're early developing in terms of evolution and early developing in children. These are, I don't like to prejudice, but these are lower structures in our nervous system. So amygdala is does things very differently than face area. It's recognizing the significance of things, not what it is, but what is its value to me, including especially, is this threatening or not? But people think of it as sort of the threat area, but it actually recognizes things that are very positive too. So it's putting a valuation on things very quickly. It's your first early warning signal in the brain that something threatening is there. You've seen a lion, and it happens very fast. You've seen a million people talk about this probably, but when you see a snake, you don't have a snake recognition area, but you do have a animate objects area in your brain. So you see it quickly, but your amygdala sees its importance immediately, that this is something you're afraid of, and gives you the whole effect of fight or flight, and your body reacts. And commonly you also jump if you weren't expecting it. So the amygdala does a lot of that for you. It says, it might take you a long time to recognize this snake and figure it out and think about it and decide whether you want to pet it or not and whatever. But before any of that happens, your amygdala says, this is something to be afraid of, and starts you mobilizing your whole body, all of your emotional and affective and getting ready and fight or flight stuff starts to happen. And you all know that because when you're walking and you see an unexpected snake, you jump before you feel like you're even conscious of it. And then you kind of are ashamed, like, oh, it's just a little garden snake. And you recognize that something happened fast and then something happens much slower. And we'll be talking about that. But the amygdala is the fast part. And it's kept all your ancestors alive. So feel good about your amygdala. Sometimes people feel like, oh, it's such an old thing, I don't like it. But it's kept you alive. Okay, the amygdala does that. And there's some people in our church will recognize that we used to have an individual in our church who had Williams syndrome. And one of the interesting things about Williams syndrome is that they have a very unreactive amygdala. Not everything's known about why that is. But one of the upsides is people with Williams syndrome show no signs of racism. They don't have a fear reaction to people of a different color. Whereas if you measure in the amygdala and you show people a black face or a white face, and they're in America and they're a white person, the amygdala will light up. So for some time, people have gone, oh my God, the amygdala is showing fear to the picture of the black face. Again, in America and for a white person. But it does happen. But it doesn't happen for Williams syndrome, showing kind of this really nice localized thing. The amygdala is really a key part of that. Okay. Third part of the brain is prefrontal cortex that I'm going to talk about anyway. And you'll see the little liners here regulating racial bias, and that's certainly not the only thing it does, but we'll be talking about that. Prefrontal cortex is a much later developing part of your brain. And you probably know this, but it's the last part of your brain to develop evolutionarily. And it's the last part of your brain to develop as a child. It's not really fully wired up until your early 20s. Very late developing part of the brain. And as such, it is the best part of your brain for picking up the culture. It is not pre-wired when you get born. It's not ready to go at all. It's ready to pick up what's going on in this environment. How do I adapt to this particular environment? So it's a much more flexible, fast learning part of your brain. The amygdala has a lot of things that you've inherited that just says, you're afraid of snakes. You're more likely, you're prepared to learn to be afraid of snakes. because you've inherited that. But in prefrontal cortex, mostly the things you're going to pick up are from the culture in which you're born. Okay. This is one of the first experiments that was really kind of cool in prefrontal cortex. And they discovered that different parts of prefrontal cortex lit up depending on whether someone belongs in your group, whatever that is. It could be white people or people who come from the Middle East, or people who cheer for the Patriots. However you imagine you're in a group of people, in prefrontal cortex, you'll find that it'll respond differently. It'll respond differently to people who are in your, they call them in group and out group. So whatever you define as your group, and by the way, that changes. Sometimes you're a Patriots fan, sometimes you're a white person, sometimes you're a scientist. We have a lot of groupings we're in. But in this part of the brain, it differentiates. It says, when you're thinking about, when you see someone that's in your in group, one part of prefrontal cortex lights up. And when you see or hear or talk with someone who's in an out group, a different part of your prefrontal cortex lights up. So anyway, I hope I've been able to say that there are these differences. Your fusiform area lights up differently by race. Your amygdala lights up differently by race. And among many other things, your prefrontal cortex will light up differently according to whatever the group is, including race. Just a little bit more about prefrontal cortex, because that's going to be important for us. What's it do? I just want to show you this enormous connectivity. And you might have heard of it being the center of executive functions. It's the part of your brain that is controlling most of the rest of your brain to orient it toward the future. Say, you know, I know you got these fast things, the amygdala does and the fusiform cortex does, but we're in charge here. We're the executive. And right now we're trying to listen to this concert, and we're not going to engage in thinking about snakes right now. And we're not going to jump in the path. We're going to take a different path and so on. But the prefrontal cortex is preparing for the future. And it does that in part by controlling all of those other things. To say, amygdala, stop being so feisty about this. Don't worry about it. Or alternatively, let's take a different path where there aren't any snakes, because I don't want to get afraid. So the prefrontal cortex is planful, anticipates the future, and makes good action decisions in order to make sure that you're choosing the best, making the best choices about what to do next. Okay, let me just check my time here. Okay, I'm doing terrible. When is prejudice found in the brain? I can do this one quickly. Turns out that people do things like measure waveforms. This is a subpart of something that you know as EEGs, but these are evoked potentials. They're you show something and you just quickly see how the brain reacts to it. And a key thing is that these are different parts of the brain, but they show, in fact, that we react differently to black. I don't like the way they choose the word black targets. That's not my word. Black individuals, white individuals, that there are distinctive waveforms. And the first ones occur incredibly early. N100 is a negative part of the wave that occurs within 100 milliseconds, which is incredibly rapid, well below consciousness. Then there's a P200 wave, which is positive. And again, you can see it doesn't look like much difference between black and white, but it's very significant. So that happens really fast, that your brain is categorized according to race within 200 milliseconds. And people don't know exactly where to count consciousness, but it's much closer to 300 milliseconds before you're ever going to be conscious of anything. So a lot of this processing can happen rapidly, that your brain has decided this is a, and I probably make that distinction now. We'll talk about in development. It isn't that your brain is primarily focused on race at its beginning. It's focused on in-group versus out-group. This person is different than me, is what makes these waveforms look really different. So if you're white, a person who's Black is different than me in our culture. But the main thing, the lesson I want to say is that some of that happens way before you're conscious that you have even seen them. In the same way that you jump to the snake before you realize that you've seen a snake. And here's a longer time scale. Some parts of your brain don't see the face, don't do anything about the face for 3 times the length of time it takes your fusiform gyrus to already be acting on this and saying, oh, that's not me. That's someone in not my group. Okay. So I guess what I really want to say is that timing is going to be important. That is, some things happen incredibly fast, you're not in conscious control of them, and some things happen very slow, and they tend to be more conscious, and you have some sense that you're in control of them, much less than we used to think, of course. Okay, how does prejudice develop in the brain? You know, is this something we're born with? Do we develop it in our culture? How does it work? And there's lots of studies, and I don't want to get into this deeply, but I'll just give you some of the titles. Positive intergroup contact modulates fusiform gyrus activity to black and white faces. So it turns out that fusiform gyrus that we talked about at the beginning, if you have positive intergroup contact with people of multiple races, that has an effect, even on that incredibly early response. Remember, that's happening in 170 milliseconds. But if you've had good intergroup contact with people of multi-races and stuff, then the fusiform gyrus changes its responsivity. It is responsive to the fact that you have been in a culture where there are positive intergroup relations. Another one, early experience shapes amygdala sensitivity to race. And an enormous study looked at all kinds of adoptions and people who moved to different countries and stuff to see what happens to that amygdala fear thing about, you know, this responsivity to race, but to ethnicity, to gender, all kinds of things that happen. You get that fear burst. And that turns out to be very responsive also to early experience during childhood. That is, it's not something given, but it's something that actually develops. And another study, a critical period for faces. That face thing does have a critical period. That is, its social contact can change, whether you have a racist or a sexist or whatever reaction really quickly or not, but it's pretty not plastic when you're grown up. Your brain sort of gets wired in, as you've heard before, very plastic during childhood, but you get hardened in your ways, and it gets habitual to have this either racist or sexist or whatever reactions in something like fusiform gyrus. More recently, more and more studies now come out and say, new evidence like this one, that racism isn't natural, because people mostly thought it's so fast, all these racist parts of our brain, it's so fast it must be built in. And more of the evidence is saying, no, it is really fast and it's really early, but it's more plastic than we've been talking about. And so there's many studies now of people in unusual situations of development, meaning not USA. what can be done to reduce or control bias and prejudice, most of which is unconscious, happens before you know it. And there's even articles now, neural mechanisms of prejudice intervention. I'm just putting this up so people can get it later if they want to. These articles aren't fabulous, but they do give you some pretty good summaries. I'm going to reduce it a bit to talk about there's really two kinds of approaches. One is a bottom-up, that is, take what I just talked about, early experience, and work on unlearning the biases. You know, just get those low-level things, bottom up, where we get these automatic racist or sexist or genderist or whatever, and unlearn them. So I'm going to call that a bottom-up approach. Another is a top-down approach, where you take what prefrontal cortex can do and control them. And I want to be clear, in this case, prefrontal cortex doesn't actually remove the bias. When they do the studies, it's not that prefrontal cortex says, okay, don't do that anymore. But what's clear is that prefrontal cortex can control it, can modify it, modulate it so that it's less or more. And maybe I wasn't going to do this, but I think I should probably. Probably a lot of you have heard of the Phineas Gage, the famous patient who was working for the railroad, and he was using a tamping bar with dynamite, and he hit the dynamite and the tamping bar went up through his forehead, straight up here, up through his chin, up the top of his head, blew out his prefrontal cortex. And he's the #1 most famous neurological patient in the world because of what happened to him. His personality changed, it became different in lots of ways, but mainly people described him as disinhibited. A lot of things that used to be kind of under his control as a person who wanted to live with people and so on, he lost control of them. And he was impulsive and distractible in ways that he hadn't been. And I looked it up just to make sure. Yes, he started saying racist and sexist things that he hadn't been saying. He lost control of that. So he was disinhibited in all kinds of ways. I forgot to look up whether he still had toileting control. I think he did. I never read that he had to wear diapers or stuff. But anyway, that's another part of prefrontal cortex anyway. So anyway, he's disinhibited, doesn't have the ability to control a lot of the things that we call bias and prejudice. Can they be unlearned? And I went too fast. I'm going to make a kind of little bit too big a statement, but you may have heard of this. There's tons of workshops and seminars and things that are done in companies and schools and so on, where people take a anti-bias course or seminar. And by and large, and it's a big by and large, they don't work very well. They work while you're in the institute you're working in and with a group of people. That is, they reduce kind of the evidence of bias that we can measure either physiological or behaviorally. But if you come back 3 months later, the long-term effects are usually not there. And this is a major review here that looked at, I don't know how many, but more like hundreds than 20s, and said, you know what, all that work is not working. And that can be discouraging. Here's just a couple of the things about results and the conclusion. Caution is thus advised when it comes to programs aiming at reducing biases. But here's a good line, because they're worried, oh my God, are people going to say the biases are there and we can't get rid of them? And it says, no, this does not weaken the case for implementing widespread structural and institutional changes that are multiply justified. So this goes back to those things that I was talking about. You have to actually change the culture. You can't just have a seminar and have all of those old low parts of the brain all of a sudden become not racist, sexist, all of the biases. They're hard to change. And they're partly hard to change because the culture often is not changed. So you go to your seminar in your company and they do some really nice awareness raising of your biases and so on. And it even changes you during the seminar. I lost my train of thought there. But at any rate, I've already said they don't change the fact that the bias is there in any significant way. Because, oh yeah, that's what it is. Because when they go back out into the regular culture, they are still picking up the fact that we have a systemically racist culture. And the brain is really good at picking up those patterns and says, oh, okay, well, in that seminar, remember, this part of the brain is really good at knowing what to do in this context. In this context, I shouldn't behave, think, feel in racist ways. But then you come out and the culture is still reinforcing the same old things. So it's very hard to get rid of it with short-term interventions. And this is just an article saying culture does make a difference. So if we could implant people into new cultures, which didn't have systemic racism and so on and so forth, their brains would potentially adapt more quickly to even short-term interventions. So bottom-up functions, amygdala, fusiform gyrus, they're largely automatic, unconscious, reflexive, habitual, so on. They're fast rather than slow and hard to change. They've developed over a long period of time, and you should assume it's going to take a lot of time and effort to unlearn them. It's not something where they're not part of your awareness system. So we can't just say, I don't want to be biased anymore, because these parts of your brain are still biased. They're hard to change, and they require more systemic change in the surroundings that your brain is picking up all the time. Top-down strategies, doing something with the prefrontal cortex. On the other hand, the prefrontal cortex is fast to know, here's things to learn in this part of our culture, and I can damp down and modify those fast old things. And the main point I want to talk about is I have to anticipate them, though. And that's what prefrontal cortex is actually good at, is anticipating the kinds of problems I'm going to have and the kinds of things I could do, because it's future oriented. And I guess I'll make the point here. It's too late if you haven't anticipated that your own biases are going to interfere with your behaving like a good person. If you don't anticipate it and get ready for it, then it's way too late, because the lower parts of your nervous system have already made their decisions. They're already moving toward you being afraid of that person, not wanting to sit next to them, being jumpy around them, thinking that they're really different than you in these kind of really strong and biased and automatic ways. Those have already happened. So if you come into a situation and you're not preparing with your prefrontal cortex, then the other things happen quick, just like jumping a snake. It's very hard to tell your brain, don't jump to the snake after you've seen the snake. There's lots of things you can do so you don't jump by saying, there's snakes in there, I'm not going to take that path. Or alternatively, I like snakes before it happens. I like snakes, and I wonder if this might be a really cool snake. I'm looking for it. I can do things ahead, but I can't be walking down the path, and then the snake makes a rattle, and then my brain goes, don't worry, it's just a nice snake. Too late, too late. So these top-down executive functions, they're goal-directed, future, so on, planful, strategic, deliberate, reflective, so on. They're slow. So they have to work by planning ahead, anticipating. This is a situation where I'm going to be biased. I'm going to jump. So I can plan so I don't get myself in situations where my brain does those old, stupid, and biased things. I anticipate them. I just came across this article, which I thought, this is just a popular article, but is the brain in the brain of a racist a lousy prefrontal cortex? So it's just making the point of, with prefrontal cortex, we can suppress, we can anticipate, we can modify, and so on, with enough time and anticipation, all that stupid racist stuff. Prefrontal cortex is really strong at doing it, but it's not strong enough in Phineas Gage's case. And there are people who definitely have much weaker prefrontal cortex than others. And there are whole articles that have come out in the last 2 years about are people who are liking authoritarian regimes, not to mention any nearby, who seem to not behave prefrontally, not anticipating the future much and reacting instinctively, unquote, quickly to things. And for those people, they seem to like a very authoritarian society that makes the rules and everything clear, and you pretty much follow them. That's a much longer argument. I shouldn't have done that because it's too superficial. But so what does a prefrontal strategy look like? And some of you have heard this, I'm sure, but what's wrong with this picture? Here's the New York Philharmonic in 1950. Now, if you happen to be a woman and you're watching this, oh, that's a good bias. I bet you there's some men, when I showed this, who didn't even notice anything wrong with it, myself probably included, but every woman probably immediately noticed there are no women in that whole screwy orchestra in 1950. And there weren't any in any of the orchestras except the occasional flautist and harpist. So that's the way they were. They were all that way. They were part of a bias that we as a culture had, that men are fabulous top-level musicians and women aren't. And then a prefrontal type intervention happened and changed it. Ruth and I were just at the symphony, and as you probably know, it's not a majority women, but it's definitely near equality. And what happened? Well, the great thing is it's one of the best social science experiments ever. In just before, end of 1960s, blind auditions entered the world. So an external thing that had to be planned to say, you know what, maybe women could be good orchestra players, but they're not getting through the auditions. And what if we did them blind? So we couldn't actually have that whole fusiform and amygdala thing happen. But I want to actually tell you that's not what happened. It's so interesting that this change of instituting blind auditions was actually done by men, that is championed by men, but not to increase the numbers of women who got in. It was really around the fact that there were men who felt that the auditions were prejudiced in favor of people who went to just the top music schools. If you went to Juilliard, you had a bias on the audition committee. You're going to get in. If you went to Southern Idaho State Music School, they're not going to let you in. They don't even know that, but they're going to have a prejudice against you. So anyway, men instituted it, but the beneficiaries were women. People, I just love it that this is how control works. Systemically, men were running it, but they didn't think it was fair to men. I thought that was beautiful. And it inadvertently made it so that women went through this dramatic change. And you can see this graphic that was basically level since antiquity. And then it just, in a very short period, began a complete new, what's the word for that, slope. And rising to, here you can see it's still in the 30%, but now it's even higher than that. So here was a big social science intervention, and it's doing it blind because we know that we have prejudice, we know we have bias, and that men cannot be trusted to do the auditions fairly. And I think Ruth knows this story, so I think I'll tell it. I think it's a good joke line that they found they actually had to tell people to audition. I think you know what a blind audition means. There's a screen or something, so you can't, the orchestra leaders can't see who's there. But somebody realized that they could tell by the high heels of women that it was a woman, and they were still underappreciated. There was a bias against the women if you could hear their high heels clicking on the floor. So they had to institute a don't wear shoes rule to make the auditions really blind. It's cool. Okay, I'm almost done. So the things we do in consciousness raising interventions are good. Making biases conscious is a start, but it's not actually going to make the changes we need. And anticipating those biases and making real strategic decisions like blind auditions, and there are many others like that, but saying, I'm going to plan ahead. I know we're going to be biased in those auditions, so we're going to plan ahead and do it blind. Or some of your teachers, there's incredible biases about grading. Many experiments have shown if you just give a, you can change the names on the papers and they get graded differently because people have biases about what those names mean. So anticipating that I'm going to be biased about someone because of their name, because of their race, because of their gender, anticipating that is key to making good decisions, like saying, you know what, I better be blind about this, not put their names on it or hide them, so that I give a fair grading. And there's many, many things like that that people are finding we have to do because the biases are there. They're not genetic. We've learned them from the environment, but they're very hard to unlearn. And the most efficacious things are to say, plan for them. So I'll just go to sort of one of the biggest books, if you want to read something about this, called Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt. And she looked at police work, and it's just dramatically scary research and how if you're Black, you're much more likely to get shot. She did 1 million experiments, which used video games and stuff to really map this out. And she works with police. What do we do about it? And it doesn't help to just say, you know, it's racist to shoot Black people more than white people. What she realized is that she had to change police forces in more strategic ways and essentially start to help them avoid confrontations where they're scared, where they're worried from the start. Because you know what happens in those? You don't use your prefrontal cortex. When you're walking down an alley and you hear a noise, that whole amygdala thing happens before your prefrontal cortex is ready. And you shoot first and think later. And so she works with police forces to make sure that those situations don't happen. Don't put police in situations where they're not going to use their prefrontal cortex. Let's work on this. And she talks about these things you need. If you want to overcome bias, you need time. That is, you need to plan ahead. You need safety. You can't be afraid right now because being afraid sucks up prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex isn't very good when you're afraid because the amygdala is really strong then. It's saying, jump, jump, please jump. You need support. There needs to be good things around you, people, etc. The context, big things in general. You know what? You're worse off if it's dark than if it's nice and light out. And the community that you live in makes a big difference in whether you're going to behave biased and what your goals are. What are you trying to do here? Are you trying to reduce bad things from happening, or are you trying to punish people and so on? And the values we have about things like racism, those need to change. And they're much more systemic and around us, and they work. I can skip this. So I want to end with just how I have decided I talk about this. I'm not recommending this for anyone else, but I now say, if anyone asks, and to be honest, no one's asked yet, but any of you might, is my brain racist? And I would say there are many parts of my brain that are racist and sexist and ageist and ableist. Because all of these things are not just about race, they're about anything that's in-group, out-group. I have biases in my brain that I've picked up from our culture, and they're hard to unlearn. And I like to say, but they're the stupid parts of my brain. They're old evolutionarily, they're old that children have them, and adults outgrow these parts of our brain and get control of them. So yes, I have racist parts of my brain, but they're the stupid parts. And here's how I'm trying to say this last paragraph. Oh, I can't read my own thing here because I've got a thing in the way. Yeah. I have plans to use the other parts of my brain to overcome these stupid parts. Just give me enough time, some support, some safety, less pressure, and a community to learn with. And I used this slide when I was talking to ministers, and perhaps a really good minister who understands how my brain works. So anyway, that's how I'd like to end that. It's giving prefrontal cortex a good chance. And that means some systemic changes we need to make, some anticipations we need people to say, these are the situations in which you're likely to behave in racist, sexist ways, and so on. And here's some other behaviors you can try, like doing blind auditions. These things can get around the problems you're having. Anyway, I've talked on way too long. So let's see if anybody has anything they would like to object or say. You've never had a racist thought in your mind or whatever. I'm going to turn off my sharing here. And Ruth, can you, I'm not hearing you, Ruth.
I make that mistake over and over.
I think Pete Tasker has a question.
Yes, I want to say to people, well, David, there are a couple of questions in the chat or comments, but we'll take Pete. But other people, if you want to go to the reactions button at the bottom, sort of right side of your screen, you can raise your hand or raise your physical hand. That's okay. Okay, Pete.
I wonder how quickly this research is going to be picked up and be used by defense lawyers in defending police people who have shot a Black person in a in an emergency, not emergency situation, but in a high risk situation in the context of what David described triggers all these immediate reactions.
It's certainly being used a lot. And again, because that's true. If you put a person in a high risk, got to react fast. You got to shoot him before he shoots you. Then those lower stupid parts of your brain take over. And so people would argue, he was put in a situation, he or she, that he had to react fast, and that's unfortunate. And but you should put yourself there and see how you would feel, and so on. And that's why Eberhardt's work is so important, because she says, you know what? We put people in these situations when we don't need to. We do not need to go to confrontation about a sticker on the car and the license plate that's upside down. That and we should have social workers go to domestic abuse situations, and people who say,
a weapon.
Yeah, without a gun, and say, let's try to diffuse this for a moment before we pull out our gun. So she is much more in that kind of mode, rather than coming and thinking that the thing that differentiates you is the gun you have. It's in the kind of, how do we make a new kind of police force that is much more prefrontal and anticipates this is likely to go into a bad situation, and here's how I can diffuse it, rather than here's how I can punish it or eliminate it.
Tony and I are impressed that the British tend to not go in armed, the British police.
I know. Ruth and I are watching all these procedural cop shows from England, and it's still a shock when you see them. You say, I think you should have a gun.
Yeah.
Or just, that's a good example of the bias, that we just are so used to it. That's what our brain does. It says they should have guns, and we have to unlearn that. I mean, England does okay. I realize Ruth, is all right if I see a couple questions here?
Eric. Oh,
I don't want to deal with Eric yet. Katie.
Sorry, Eric.
But Katie, because she brings up an implicit bias test, which I chose just not to talk about. yeah, there's been a ton of work on this, Katie. Katie's question is the implicit bias test, which you probably, most of you have heard of, IAT. Tons of people have been given the implicit bias test. And it's a longer thing. I kind of avoided it, Katie, because I was afraid that I would have to take too much time. So what
we
the
can go
implicit,
get coffee later and you can tell me about it.
but I at least want to give a quick,
Yeah.
superficial. The implicit bias test is only measuring one of the areas that you have to think about, which is essentially, if I were to really cluster it, it's really just measuring how does the temporal cortex deal with things, which is just what are the associations you have. And as you might know, it doesn't predict very well what behaviors you actually will have. It's really good at saying that you associate, colors with this, and what are some other examples? Yeah, by sex, by nationality, that we associate things in temporal neocortex. And so when you do these very artificial little things, it shows that you react a little bit faster if you've been, if a word has kind of primed you. Priming is a big thing. So I say, if I say gun first, and then I show you another object, you're more likely to see it as gun-like if I first to show you the gun. And there's all kinds of things about race and gender and all that with it. But they don't predict very well what you're actually going to do in a situation. And they don't predict very well how you're going to feel. And I kind of avoided talking about that whole thing. But the three parts of the brain that I chose are really important to me. And that is the fusiform gyrus is in the back part of the brain, which is just about how do you see things. The amygdala is in the part of the brain that says, how do you feel about things? And the prefrontal cortex is in the part of the brain that is, what are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. And those three things are not the same thing. And so our biases actually are of three types. We have biases that bias how we see things, also say here or whatever. We have biases like that. And the IAT is really good at picking that up. We have biases about that. But we have biases about how we react, what we're going to do. And the IAT is much less predictive about that. And we have biases about how we feel. Some of us are much more afraid of snakes than others. Some of us are much more afraid of different kinds of people than others, and so on. So the IAT has had a little bit of a second, what should I say? People are seeing it as more limited than at first. At first, it was just like dramatic. And everybody was like, oh my God, because it revealed that we have these biases in us. And again, oh, I know I can say this, Katie, I would say, it's one of the stupid parts of your brain. It is really, it's really got, you got associations that are really stupid.
Can I just say, I don't want to take too much time because I know other people have questions, but I ask because we talked about retraining the brain. And if anyone's seen Renee Meyer's TED Talk, she talks about how you might be able to change your biases. And when I took one of the implicit association tests, my answers were surprising. And I'll just name that I had a slight preference for African-American over most white people have a preference for white faces.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's probably because I live with African-Americans all day, right, and my brain has probably shifted. So I'm curious about that piece of if you can retrain these biases, because a lot of the research that you cited, I've heard as, and this isn't a pick on you, it's a pick on the field, very white centric. How do white brains react to different things? And so I'm just really curious about that. So thank you.
Yeah. So the answer is yes, it can learn to overcome those stupid biases, but it's just not something you do in an hour workshop. And it's just not something conscious you do in the same way that you can't say, I'm not going to jump when I see a snake. It doesn't work. But it doesn't mean that you can learn to love snakes. There are lots of people who love snakes. I should probably use that analogy, but we're fine. They don't get scared at all because they, this is what they do and they see them all the time. And some of those studies that I showed just showed that if people grow up, and even if you actually, one of them is about college students, if you put people in a really nice integrated society, then it will work. Not in 1 hour, but your brain starts to pick up, you know what? We're all the same. Oh, that's a good example. We all go to Cornell. And then that overwhelms the other stuff because we say, I like that guy because he goes to Cornell, like me. In fact, someone did a great, what's the word? Great summary of this. If you really want to get rid of the bias, you want to get up into prefrontal cortex where you're planning. And someone just said it beautifully that I just saw a video the other day. This has been good for me to kind of catch up, but he said, there's 3 things. One is just, I forget the word is, being together, just being together. That'll help. But he says a better thing is to experience things together. That is at the deeper, you're going to change more of the brain if you're experiencing things together. But he said the thing that really works, which is fabulous for what I've been saying, prefrontal cortex is goal directed. So the thing that really works is if you get everybody working on the same goal. So that's why you as a teacher and I would want to say, let's do projects where we're all working together. We're not all doing exactly the same thing, but we have a big project in mind. And that really deadens those boundaries and those frightening things, sharing goals, because you get that front part of your brain really going into it. I don't care what color he is. I don't care whether it's a man or a woman. We're trying to do our project. And all of those stupid parts of the brain get damped down when we have a goal that we share. And so the best thing is not even to just be together, but to be wanting to do something together. And that really works. It just, you can literally measure it and just see that in Fusiform Gyrus, it doesn't matter now. It's like the brain has said, look, we're not into race. We want to solve this problem. And, so we want shared goals.
David,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. We have at least 3 more questions. Meg, then Eric, then Judy.
Okay. Well, I did want Eric.
He's
Before-
next after Meg.
But before,
No, it's okay. Whoops. He can go ahead of me. I'll catch you later.
okay. Well, Eric, and David, I asked David if he would do it. I want to actually have someone talk about what we're doing. That is,
Yeah.
see, as a church, we have decided to be prefrontal about this. We're going to actually take some affirmative, forward-looking action. And the next meeting around this topic is, and I took down my slides, is on March 6th. And I wondered, I don't know, Eric, if you feel comfortable, but David, I asked him to think about it. David, can you prep us for that a little bit? Why? Because this is exactly what we need to do. Say, we get together, we get a goal in mind of reducing, expanding our circle, making it more inclusive, all of that. But we take action. It's not enough to just raise our consciousness and says we're racist. We got stupid parts of our brains too. But as a church, we're saying we are going to start taking actions. David, can you just prep people so they'll come on March 6th?
David's on mute.
Yeah.
You said it really really beautifully, David, and I really resonated to that last slide where you talked about using other parts of our brains to overcome the stupid parts in a community to learn with. And I think that, among other things, that's what the eighth principle implementation team is doing, is providing the opportunity within a community of our congregation and other people who join these sessions to look at other parts of our brain and to see, overcome them, and to examine on the 6th, are we truly a hospitable and inclusive community, and to look at our practices and our beliefs, and are we acting on them, and to do something about it. It's not just a time to contemplate your navel, if you wish. It's to take action after you've done this examining. And also, if I could I put in a plug for one other, for the book, Defunding,
defunding
Fear. Yeah, which is also right along the topic you brought up, David, about mentioning about changing the culture and changing society. That's tomorrow. If you'd like to join, there's room. But thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for pulling this all together.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. And Eric, I know you're on that group too. If there's anything more you want to say before your question, that's welcome.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is we've used the term radical hospitality in the past, and while it's a noble sentiment, I think very non-radical hospitality practices could be used by all. I remember from General Assembly a number of years ago, I went to a workshop about how to welcome the stranger and so forth. And one thing stuck with me after all these years is again, this kind of gets back to neuroscience a little bit maybe, but people make a decision about whether a church is going to be their church home within like the first 5 minutes of them walking in the door. So that 5 minutes, who they talk to and who engages with them is super important. And we have some examples of people who have said publicly that First Parish became their church home because they met so-and-so within the first 2 minutes of walking in the door, and they knew right then and there. And we have plenty of examples where the exact opposite happened. So I think there's some very simple things from a hospitality thing that we can do that I hope we'll get a chance to talk to at the next session. But anyway, I had two questions for you, David. One is, first off, fascinating talk. Thank you for doing it. But how do we talk? I'm wondering, how do we talk to people who may clearly have a different opinion than us about the other? And I'm not going to walk to them and say, oh, well, your prefrontal cortex is clearly not aligned to this. Maybe you should get some help or something like, that's not a winning strategy. I'm wondering how you have a conversation with somebody that can recognize that, at some level, our brains are pre-wired, or there is a wiring that we have to unlearn, we have to undo. That was sort of the first question. And the second question is sort of related, is, some people anyway, have a tendency toward, if something is happening to somebody else and it's not affecting me or my immediate family, then it's not my problem. Countless examples of people, voting against LGBT rights until it's emerged that, their sister is gay, and then all of a sudden they're for it. Right. So it's that also kind of fear thing. So how do you have those kinds of conversations, knowing that your brain has some wiring to undo?
Yeah, so those are hard questions, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer the first one, but it does allow me to say something that's really interesting about how the brain works in this. There's a part of our, you may have heard of mirror neurons, that our brain kind of mirrors. When we watch someone take an action, our brain actually is taking the action inside to mirror it, to say, oh, I see what he or she's doing. And your brain, literally, motor cortex, lights up to say, I'm sort of dancing too, or in your case, I'm sort of playing the French horn too with my lips. And that's how we know what they're doing. It turns out we're mirroring the movements. It's something that people didn't know happened. But we also mirror their emotions. That is part of probably one of the most central things that differentiates us from other animals, is that we mirror emotion. That is, our brains are trying to figure out what is the emotion that person is feeling, because that turns out to be a driver of what they're going to do next. Are they frightened right now? Are they someone, that's falling in love? There's sort of that, if you want to predict the human behavior, are they hungry and need, that's what you want to get to. And our brains are really powerfully set up to do that more than any other animals by far. We mirror, and we call it empathy. We are able to empathize with the other person and say, I feel their pain. The sad thing, I just didn't have enough time to talk about it, is we do not have empathy for people in the out group from us, whatever it is. Again, race is used as an example here in the US because that's what one of the things we differentiate. But in other cultures, lots of other things happen. We just say, and not say, our brains don't light up. The empathy part of our brain does not light up when we see the person as not like us. And that can literally happen. It's just astonishing how quick you can literally make it happen. Like sport teams are that way. People have less empathy for the New York Giants player who gets run over by a car than for a Patriots player who gets run over by a car. You can just see it in the brain. We just say, they're not us. It doesn't matter as much. And I don't feel their pain. I just don't, I'm not able to do that. I don't know if not able is the right word, but I don't feel their pain. And there's tons of studies of that. So it's a real part of all of the biases we have. The first question, Eric, was, I lost it already because I have no memory left.
Just you know, how do you talk to people
Oh,
who you know are different than you around this sort of empathy thing and sort of trying to undo bias when you know it's there?
See, I'm not an expert on that. And I think I am going to bow out of answering that. I think that's why we go to church is, you know, this is a minister question. How do we do that? How do we remain a community of faith with differences amongst us? I think is one of the central things that a UU church is meant to do. And I know sometimes people have complained that we're not so great when people aren't just like us. You know, would a Trump supporter feel like they could come to our church? And I think that is one of the things that our church needs to work on. And I don't think I'm the one. But I like being in a group of people who are feeling that that's one of our jobs, is to try to figure out how we can handle conflict and differences of opinion and stuff without saying, which is what our brain's ready to do. The stupid part of our brain said, he's not like me. And all of a sudden I don't empathize. I just want to bash him. So one of the things that doesn't work is saying to people, as you know, you're wrong and you're stupid too. None of that has ever worked for anything. But being, I don't know, I think of our minister, I think she'd be good at it. So that's a longer, I think that takes going to church to figure out.
Thanks, David.
David, let's really quickly, because Judy Cole's been waiting. I know we're over time. So Judy, your question.
Oh, Judy, she's like an other person too.
Another person. First of all, this is so good, so fascinating. And I am probably going to be, I'm sure I'm going to be the least articulate of all the presenters and questions. But part of me for quite a while has tried to explain the anger and the otherness. And I love the phrase, the stupid part of our brain. That I hadn't never thought of it that way. I kind of think of it as the caveman. And so I need your feedback, David, if there's any credibility to what I'm saying. It seems like the caveman part of us from eons ago was rooted in survival with like a tribal kind of, as you said, like it thinks, it doesn't think, it just reacts. And so somehow part of me has often wondered if that plays much more of an important part than we so-called rational, civilized humans want to admit. And if there were a way to acknowledge that that is more active that it would be one of the first steps
Mhm.
towards being open to overriding that. But it doesn't seem to me you can override something if you don't acknowledge that it's there or that it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's perfectly said, probably better than I said it, but that's why I want to just adopt that I have stupid parts of my brain that are racist, for example.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's not that they're not there, and they are there. And so I have to do some work.
We
with
all do, of course.
but with this fabulous part of my brain, that is the best part. It's really incredibly quick learner and all of that, and I need to use it. But on the tribal thing, that's exactly what, I didn't do a good job of doing this, but the racism is not built in. Tribalism is probably. That is evolutionarily, it was an advantage if you had a tribal cooperative thing, because you could beat other people that were individuals or other tribes and so on. So the ability to keep a tribe together was critical in an evolutionary step. And it really is one of the reasons we developed this big social brain and prefrontal cortex, was be able to keep everything in track, that he is part of us. And, if I do nice things now, he's going to do nice things later. And all of those things are part of what made our brains really different. But unfortunately, in saying these people are all part of me, they're all my tribe, we also seem to have developed and those are not me. Those are bad people I'm in competition with, I'm afraid of, all of those things. So the tribal thing does seem to have been built into our nervous system. And again, not race or sex or things like that. Those are things that the cultures later develop, because in lots of cultures, skin color doesn't matter at all. It's just not part of it. But tribalism is, that it's very hard to find a culture that doesn't have in-groups and out-groups. And they are a atavistic, they're part of our past that it would be nice if we get rid of. And it's going to take work, because they're there, and exactly what you said. They're in the nervous system. They're really stupid, but they are really well built, because it's what kept cultures, made cultures strong. So that's not going to go away very quickly, and we really have to learn how to manage it. And you can manage it in the way I've just started to talk about, by saying, yeah, we have tribalism built in, us versus them. And these are the things, one of them I just said, if we can share goals, as you know, what's one of the cool things, like in England, they have these incredibly racist football team, what do you call it, bar scenes. But all of a sudden, when they go to the game, the racial stuff goes away completely, because they're all Tottenham, and they hug each other and love each other, to say, I'm with you too, Anyway, more of that. Now, Ruth, come on, she wants to be.
I'm waving, yes. We are really past time. Thank you, Judy, and thank you, David. And thanks to all of you who attended and are still here. And come back next Tuesday to hear David Beauvais. I think that's it. So bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you. Fabulous.
That was excellent, David. Thank you so much.